Eleanor Hartley, Duchess of Rowanshire, was standing at the foot of the great staircase at Rowan Court, when the first grey light came through the fanlight above the door, and she was looking down at a small carved horse someone had set, with great care, in the exact centre of the bottom step. She did not pick it up. She did not call for a servant. She did not go up to wake her husband, though she could hear, faintly, the sound of his horse being led round to the stables at that very hour, hooves loud in a house that had been silent all night. She crouched instead, skirts pooling on the cold stone, and turned the little painted horse until its blind wooden eye faced the door he would soon walk through. By morning she would know exactly what she meant to do with what she had learned, and it would not be what anyone in that county expected of a woman so plainly, so publicly, made to feel like furniture in her own home. The summer of 1816 had come to Denholm the way it always did, thick and unhurried, settling over hedgerows and harvest fields as if it had all the time in the world, which was a lie the season told every year, and every year the county believed. 2 years before that morning on the staircase, Eleanor Aldridge had married Julian Hartley, 7th Duke of Rowanshire, in a ceremony that the county agreed was sensible rather than romantic. Her father, a gentleman farmer of excellent bloodlines and indifferent luck, had died owing more than anyone liked to say aloud, and the marriage had settled his debts as neatly as it had settled her future. Nobody had called it a love match. Everybody had called it suitable, and Eleanor had learned, over 2 years, exactly how much weight that single word could carry when it was the only word anyone used about you. She had brought competence to Rowan Court the way some brides brought linens. She kept the household books in a hand steadier than the steward's. She knew which tenant farms flooded first in a wet spring, and which needed their fences mended before the sheep found the gaps themselves. She had learned all of this from her father, who had taught her arithmetic before he taught her to dance, and who had left her, along with his debts, a single piece of advice she had repeated to herself so many times it had worn smooth as a coin in a pocket. Paper remembers what people forget, he used to say, tapping the ledger with one blunt finger. People will lie to your face, Eleanor. Paper does not know how. It was Alaric Voss, the estate's man of business, who had first begun to speak of her usefulness in that particular tone, the tone that made a virtue sound like an inventory item. He was a smooth, unhurried man, careful with his consonants, warm in the way poured cream is warm, and he had managed the Rowanshire accounts for 11 years before Eleanor ever crossed the threshold. It was Voss who told the Duke, gently, reasonably, over brandy in the estate office, that a man in his position did well to marry a capable woman and require nothing further of her. It was Voss who first mentioned, in passing, as though it cost him nothing to say it, that a widow of his acquaintance, a Mrs. Camille Doran, kept excellent, undemanding company for gentlemen whose wives understood the arrangement of great houses better than the arrangement of great feeling. Julian Hartley had not needed much convincing. He had been 8 years old when his own mother left Rowan Court in the middle of a January night, taking nothing but a small trunk, and leaving nothing behind but a note his father burned before Julian ever read it. His father had raised him afterward on a single doctrine, delivered without cruelty and therefore impossible to argue with. Love is a debt no one repays in full, and a wise man builds his house on usefulness instead, because usefulness, at least, keeps its word. Julian had grown into a duke who managed his estate with real skill and his marriage with none at all, and he had never once, in 2 years, examined why the distance felt safer than the alternative. The overheard verdict came on an ordinary Tuesday, through a study door left a hand's width open. Eleanor had come to bring the quarterly rent book and stopped in the corridor at the sound of her own name. "She is suitable," Voss was saying. "You need not trouble yourself further, Your Grace. I do not think she requires you to love her, only to be useful to her in return, and you have managed that admirably." "I do not require her to be more than useful," Julian said. "It is enough." Eleanor had stood in the corridor with the rent book against her chest, and had not made a sound. She had not wept. She had not knocked. She had walked back the way she had come and set the book down on the hall table with both hands, very steadily, the way a woman sets down something she does not trust herself to hold much longer. That had been 8 months before the morning on the staircase. In between there had been dinners eaten in a silence, so practised it barely registered as silence any more. And there had been Alice. Alice Hartley was 5 years old, and had her father's grey eyes, and her mother's habit of watching a room before she spoke in it. She had asked her father, 3 weeks before that dawn, whether he might come to breakfast on her birthday instead of riding out early, and he had said he would try, in the voice men use when they have already decided not to. He had, however, ridden into the village that same week, and commissioned from Wilkins the carpenter a small horse, carved from applewood and painted dapple grey to match the real pony she was not yet old enough to ride. It was, by any measure, a kindness. It was also, Eleanor thought later, the exact shape of the man's failure. He could buy love in objects far more easily than he could spend an evening delivering it in person. On the night before her birthday, Alice had carried the horse to the top of the stairs and sat there in her nightgown, feet bare on the runner, waiting to show her father the moment he came home, because she had been told, vaguely, that he was dining out and would return before she slept. She had waited past the hour the housemaid came to fetch her, past the hour Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, came up herself, with a candle and a scolding that softened the moment she saw the child's face. She had waited, in the end, until she understood, in the wordless way children understand these things before anyone explains them, that he was not coming, not that night, not for her. She had set the horse down on the bottom step instead, facing the door, and gone to bed without being carried. Eleanor learned all of this from Mrs. Pruitt at 5:30 in the morning, standing in her nightclothes in a hallway, gone the colour of ash before sunrise. And she had gone down the stairs herself to see it with her own eyes before she allowed herself a single thought about what it meant. She counted the minutes she permitted herself for what came next, as she always did, against the mantel clock in the small parlour, 10 of them, no more. Her father's old rule turned into her own iron one. When the 10 minutes were spent she stood, smoothed her skirts, and went to make certain the child was sleeping, and not merely pretending to. She was sitting on the edge of Alice's bed, her daughter's hand loose and warm in her own, when she heard the horse in the yard below, and the front door, and her husband's step on the flagstones, unhurried, unashamed, a man arriving home from an ordinary night's ordinary business. She did not go down to meet him. She sat exactly where she was, and listened to him climb the stairs, and she heard, very clearly through the old floorboards, the moment his footsteps stopped. He had found the horse. There was a long silence, longer than the house usually allowed itself, and then his footsteps went on, more slowly than before, toward his own rooms rather than hers. Eleanor sat with her daughter's hand in hers and thought, with the particular clarity of a woman doing arithmetic she has done many times before, and finally trusts the sum of, that she was done waiting to be seen. She would simply, from that morning forward, become impossible not to. She rose before the household did. She did not confront him at breakfast, because a scene fed on itself and she had no intention of feeding anything that morning except her own resolve. She ate in the small parlour alone, wrote 3 letters, and sent for Mrs. Pruitt, who arrived with her hands folded and her mouth already set in the particular flatness of a woman who has decided which side of a quarrel she stands on before it has properly begun. "You'll want tea, Your Grace, Mrs." Pruitt said. "Not a question." "I want the estate ledgers from the last 4 quarters, Eleanor said. "And I want to know, plainly, whether Mr. Voss has ever once let you check a tenant's receipt against his own book." Mrs. Pruitt considered this with the unhurried suspicion of a woman who had kept a great house's secrets for 30 years and disliked most of them. "Can't say I've ever been asked to," she said. "Can't say that's not curious, now you mention it." It was, Eleanor thought, exactly the right kind of answer. Not proof, a thread. Paper remembers, her father had told her, and she meant, before the season turned again, to make certain something had been written down. The Widdop farm had been arguing with itself for 3 years over a stretch of low pasture that flooded every wet spring, land that sat between 2 tenancies and belonged, on paper, to neither man clearly enough to matter. Voss had let the dispute simmer, collecting a shilling here and there in what he called administrative adjustment, whenever one farmer or the other came to him for a ruling. And nobody had thought to ask why an adjustment should cost money at all. Eleanor rode out to the boundary herself on a grey morning in early June, in boots rather than the half-boots the county thought suitable for a duchess, and stood in the mud with both tenant farmers, while Wilkins the carpenter, who had built half the fencing in the parish, and remembered where every post had ever stood, walked the line with her, pace by pace, and told her exactly where the original survey markers had been before the flood moved them 11 years before. "It is not your land nor his," Eleanor said finally, to the 2 red-faced men glaring past her at each other. "It is the estate's low-water meadow, and it has been for longer than either of your leases. What you are arguing over is who gets to graze it in a dry year, and that is a question with an answer, not a fight." She wrote the answer herself that same week, a rotation schedule keyed to the rainfall records her father had taught her to keep, gave a fair share to each man, and posted it, signed in her own hand, on the door of the parish hall where anyone could read it, and where anyone, crucially, could see that a decision had finally been made, and made without a shilling changing hands to make it. Old Widdop, who had not had a kind word for the house of Rowanshire in a decade, took off his hat to her in the lane a week later, which Mrs. Pruitt reported to the servants' hall with the solemnity of a woman announcing a coronation. Voss heard of it, smiled thinly, and said nothing at dinner beyond a compliment, so smooth it barely registered as one. Julian, seated at the far end of the long table, watched his wife over the candles for a moment longer than he had watched her in months, and said nothing at all, which was, for him, very nearly a declaration. The fever came to the tenant cottages along the low road in the 2nd week of July, the kind of low, persistent illness that moves through close-set houses in wet summers, and it was Eleanor who organised the broth and the willow bark and the airing of sick rooms before the parish doctor had finished his rounds of the wealthier farms first. As was his habit, she went herself into 2 of the worst cottages, sleeves rolled, and sat with children whose mothers were too fevered to sit up, and when Mrs. Pruitt scolded her for the risk she took to her own health, Eleanor said only that a duchess who could not be bothered to enter a sick tenant's cottage had no business signing rent books for it either. It was in the 2nd of those cottages that she first heard, offhand, from a woman too tired to guard her tongue. that Voss had told the family their rent was in arrears when the woman's own husband swore he had paid it in full at Michaelmas, coin counted twice into Voss's own hand. Eleanor said nothing at the time beyond a murmur of sympathy. She wrote it down that night in a small book she had begun to keep, a private ledger of her own, separate from the estate's, and she added the date, the name, the sum, and the words the man swore before witnesses beside it. It was in that same fortnight that Julian found her in the estate office late one evening, bent over columns of figures by a single candle, and stood in the doorway longer than he needed to before she noticed him. "You should not tire your eyes over Voss's arithmetic," he said. "It is not your burden. It is precisely my burden," she said, not looking up. "It is my name on the tenants' leases as much as yours, and I mean to know what is done with it." He did not answer that, but he did not leave either, and for the length of 11 minutes, which she counted without meaning to, he sat across from her and read a letter of his own by the same candle, and neither of them spoke, and it was, she thought afterward, the first quiet between them in a year that had not felt like punishment. He came home for supper 3 nights running after that, which Mrs. Pruitt marked in the kitchen the way other households marked a change in the weather. The wound Julian carried had a shape Eleanor had guessed at for 2 years, and confirmed only by accident, on an evening in late July, when Alice, sitting on her father's knee for the first time in weeks, asked him with a child's flat honesty why he had not come home the night she left him the horse. "I had somewhere else I needed to be," he said, and his voice was strange, thinner than she had ever heard it. "Did your mother have somewhere else to be too?" Alice asked when she went away. The silence that followed was long enough that Eleanor set down her needlework. Julian's hand had gone still on his daughter's hair. When he spoke again, it was not to Alice at all, but past her, to Eleanor, as though the child had opened a door he had kept shut for 24 years, and he no longer had the strength to close it himself. "She left in January," he said. "I was 8. My father told me that night that love was a debt no one ever repaid in full, and that a man who built his house on usefulness instead would never again be made a fool of the way she had made a fool of him. I have believed him longer than I have believed anything else in my life." Eleanor did not go to him. She sat very still, and said, after a moment, in the plain voice she used for figures that did not balance, "That is not wisdom, Julian. That is a wound wearing a wisdom's coat." He looked at her for a long moment, and something behind his composure, some old locked mechanism, seemed to shift half an inch and stop, unwilling yet to move the rest of the way. "I do not know how to be the other kind of man," he said finally. "You will not learn it from a study door," she said, and rose to take Alice up to bed, leaving him alone with the fire and whatever he meant to do with what had just been said aloud in his own house for the first time in his life. Voss, watching all of this compounding warmth from the edges of the household, with the patience of a man who had built his whole fortune on other people's inattention, understood before anyone else did that his particular arrangement was in danger, and moved, quietly, to protect it. He called on Mrs. Camille Doran the following week, in the small rented house at the edge of the village that his own money, though she did not know it in those terms, had helped to keep her in. Camille was 26, widowed young, and carrying a debt her late husband had left behind that Voss had bought up quietly 2 years before, holding it over her the way a man holds a rope he has no intention of ever letting go slack. "You will need to be seen with him again," Voss told her, without preamble, seated in her small parlour as though it were his own. "Twice this month at least. He has been dining at home too often of late, and a man who dines at home begins asking questions a man dining elsewhere never thinks to. I did not agree to arrange his marriage for him, Camille said, only to keep him company. You agreed, Voss said, not unkindly, which made it worse, to whatever kept your note from coming due. I have been patient about the note, Mrs. Doran. Patience is not without its terms. Camille sent for Julian that same week, and he came because he did not yet understand that he was being moved like a piece on someone else's board, and it was there, in her small parlour over tea neither of them wanted, that the events of the dawn on the staircase were set irrevocably in motion, a night neither Julian nor Camille would afterward be able to call anything but a mistake made with open eyes and closed understanding. It was the toy that undid him in the end, not the argument he had expected to have with his wife and did not get. Because Eleanor did not raise her voice, did not weep, did not so much as mention the horse for 3 full days, which unsettled him more than any accusation could have. He found himself, on the 4th morning, standing at the foot of the stairs where the little horse still sat, because no one in the household had dared to move it, and he picked it up himself at last, and held it for a long time before he carried it up to his own study, and set it on the corner of his desk, where he would see it every time he sat down to the accounts that had, until that summer, been the only thing in his life he trusted. He did not know yet that the accounts themselves were lying to him. Eleanor did. She went to Mr. Pemberton, the county's solicitor and sitting magistrate for the quarter sessions, on a market day in early August, carrying her private ledger, and a request phrased as plainly as she phrased everything. I want a formal audit of the estate accounts against the tenant's own receipts, she said, before the next rent day, conducted openly, in the barn, before whoever cares to attend. That is a serious thing to ask for, Duchess, Pemberton said, studying her over his spectacles. You understand it will not go quietly if there is anything to find. I have never once asked for anything to go quietly, Eleanor said. I have asked for it to go correctly. Those are different countries, Miss Pemberton, and I have lived in the wrong one for 2 years. Pemberton, who had known her father slightly, and respected the memory of a man who kept his own books scrupulously even while sinking under debts he could not control, agreed to preside. What Eleanor did not yet have was the proof itself, and it was Wilkins, of all people, who first put it into her hand, on an afternoon when she called at his workshop to thank him again for the horse he had carved for Alice, and found him puzzling over an old order book of his own. Funny thing, Your Grace, he said, turning the book toward her. Mr. Voss paid me for that horse out of the estate purse, not his Grace's own pocket, though his Grace gave the order himself, and told me plain it was to come from his private account. I noted it down when it happened, thinking nothing of it. But I've been going back through my books since, on account of a thing my brother said about his rent, and I find Mr. Voss has been paying a fair number of things out of the estate purse that oughtn't to be estate business at all. Show me, Eleanor said, and sat with him for 2 hours by candlelight, while he turned page after page of a plain tradesman's ledger, a small, unglamorous, devastating kind of proof, the sort that never occurred to a clever man to falsify, because he had never thought a carpenter's account book worth noticing at all. It was the loan note, though, that broke the matter fully open, a document Voss had kept locked in his own strong-box, and produced only once, months earlier, in a private conversation with Eleanor that she had not repeated to anyone since, in which he informed her, gently, regretfully, that her late father had in fact owed a private sum to the Rowanshire estate before his death, a debt Voss had been kind enough not to mention to his Grace, out of consideration for her feelings. She had believed him, for a time. She had even, in her private ledger, written the sum down with a question mark beside it, because something in the transaction had never sat easily with her memory of her father's own meticulous accounts. It was Pemberton, comparing the note's signature at Eleanor's quiet request against 3 genuine letters of her father's that she had kept in her own writing box since his death, who told her plainly that the hand was close, very close, close enough to fool a grieving daughter, but not close enough to fool a solicitor who had witnessed her father's actual signature on his own will 4 years before. "This was drawn within the last 2 years, Duchess," Pemberton said. "Your father has been dead 5. Whoever wrote this had a sample of his hand to copy from, and copied it carelessly at the crossing of the E." Eleanor sat very still when he told her this, her hands flat on the table, and said only after a long moment, "He used my own grief to keep me quiet." That was the whole of his design. "It very often is," Pemberton said. "Grief makes excellent cover for men who cannot afford to be looked at too closely." Voss, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, though not yet its full extent, moved to strike first. He called on Julian privately, with the ease of 11 years' trusted counsel, and suggested, delicately, that the Duchess's sudden interest in tenant accounts might reflect less a talent for figures than an unbecoming distrust of her husband's oldest servant, and that a wise man did not let a wife's pride unsettle arrangements that had kept his estate solvent for over a decade. He also, in the same week, sent word to Camille Doran that her note would be called due within the month unless certain services continued, a threat she received with a coldness that surprised even herself, because something in her, watching the county's quiet talk of the Duchess's competence, had begun to feel the particular shame of being used as another woman's rehearsed humiliation. Julian, to his credit, did not act on Voss's suggestion. He came instead to the estate office that same evening and asked Eleanor, without preamble, whether there was truth in what she was doing. "There is more truth in it than either of us will enjoy," she said, and showed him, for the first time, the private ledger she had kept since June. He read it by candlelight for the better part of an hour, and when he set it down his hands were not quite steady. "I have signed whatever he put in front of me for 11 years, he said. "That is not a confession," Eleanor said. "That is only an explanation, and I will want both from you eventually. Tonight I only want you to decide whether you mean to stand beside me at the audit, or whether you mean to protect the man who has been robbing your tenants under cover of your own name. I will stand beside you," he said, and it was the first time in 2 years he had said anything to her that cost him something to say. Rent day came on the last Thursday of August, and the threshing barn at Rowan Court had never held so full a crowd for so quiet a purpose. Tenants stood along the walls with their own receipt books clutched to their chests. Mrs. Pruitt had installed herself near the front, with the settled satisfaction of a woman who intended to enjoy every minute, and Pemberton sat at a plain table, with the estate's official ledger open before him, Eleanor's private ledger beside it, and Wilkins's carpenter's book beside that. Voss arrived composed, as he always was, and remained composed through the first quarter hour, through the recitation of names and sums that matched well enough to bore the room, until Eleanor rose and asked, in the mild, unhurried voice she used for arithmetic that did not balance, whether Mr. Voss might explain why the Widdop rotation dispute had cost each farmer a shilling in administrative adjustment for 3 consecutive years, when no such fee appeared anywhere in the estate's own charter of fees. An oversight in the recording, Voss said easily. A common enough clerical habit. And the carpenter's horse, Eleanor said, paid from the estate purse, though his Grace ordered it from his private account. Was that also a clerical habit, Mr. Voss? The room had gone very quiet. Wilkins, without being asked, stepped forward and set his own plain ledger on the table beside the others, and said, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be believed, that he'd note things down as they happened, plain as day, and would swear to any of it before the magistrate. Then came the Fever Cottage widow, brought by Mrs. Pruitt, though she had not been asked to attend, who stood in her good shawl and said, simply that her husband had paid his Michaelmas rent in full, coin counted twice into Mr. Voss's own hand, and that she had never once seen it entered in any book she was shown after. Voss's composure held through all of this, the way a dam holds through the first hours of a flood, visibly straining but not yet breaking, until Eleanor set the loan note on the table last of all and asked him, quietly, precisely, why her father's signature crossed its E in a manner he had never once used in 4 other letters written in his own hand across the final decade of his life. Something behind Voss's eyes went out, all at once, like a candle pinched rather than blown, and the room, watching a man's whole careful architecture come down in the space of a single silence, understood before he said a word that it was finished. I did what was necessary to secure my position, he said finally, and it was the flattest, least convincing sentence anyone in the barn had heard all morning. You did what was easiest, Eleanor said, and called it necessary so you would not have to call it anything else. Pemberton, when the room's murmur had settled, ruled plainly Voss to be dismissed from all estate business by nightfall, the falsified sums restored to every tenant named, the loan note declared void and burned before witnesses, and the matter, given the absence of any greater harm than theft compounded by cowardice, to end in dismissal and disgrace rather than in the assizes, a mercy Eleanor herself requested, standing before the whole gathered county. He does not deserve gentleness, Pemberton said quietly to her afterward. No, she agreed, but I would rather be the kind of woman who gives it than the kind who could not afford to. Voss left the county within the week, his name unspoken thereafter in any house that mattered, which was its own particular sentence. That evening, with the barn emptied, and the household settling into a quiet unlike any it had known in years, Julian came to Eleanor in the small parlour and said, without being asked, that he owed her the whole of an explanation, and not merely the half of an apology. I know the difference, she said. I have been waiting 2 years for you to learn it. He told her, then, fully, of his mother's departure, of his father's doctrine delivered like scripture over a boy too young to argue with it, of 11 years spent trusting a smooth voice, because a smooth voice asked nothing of him that felt like risk. He told her of Voss's steady encouragement toward Camille, framed always as convenience, never as cruelty, and of his own cowardice in accepting the frame, because it let him avoid the harder work of being fully present in his own house. You said once, Eleanor said, when he had finished, that you did not require me to be more than useful. I heard you say it. I have carried it 2 years. I was wrong, he said. I do not require you to be useful to me at all. I require you. That is the whole of it, and I have only just learned to say the sentence properly. She did not answer him at once. She named her terms instead, plainly, the way she named everything, and he listened to the whole of them without once looking away, that her name would stand beside his on every tenant agreement going forward. that the estate books would be kept jointly and audited openly each year as a standing practice rather than a scandal's remedy, that decisions touching Alice would be made by both of them, or not at all, and that whatever he owed Camille Doran in fairness, for a debt Voss had forced upon her and a role she had been coerced rather than chosen into, would be settled from the very funds clawed back from Voss himself, so that the wrong done to one woman was not quietly absorbed while another woman's grievance was aired in a barn. "That is fair," he said. "It is not generous," she said. "It is only fair. I have found the two are often confused in this house." "All right," he said. "All right, then," she said, and something in the room, for the first time in 2 years, felt less like held breath and more like the beginning of an exhale. Camille Doran came to Rowan Court herself, unbidden, 3 days later, and asked to speak with Eleanor alone, a request that took a courage Eleanor recognised because it mirrored her own 2 years earlier. "I do not ask you to forgive the arrangement," Camille said. "I ask only that you understand I did not choose it freely. Mr. Voss held a debt over me the way a man holds a hand over a candle, close enough to burn if I moved wrong. I am not proud of the shape my compliance took. I am only telling you it was compliance, not desire." "I believe you," Eleanor said, and meant it, because she had learned to read the difference between a woman protecting herself and a woman enjoying her power, and Camille's whole bearing was the first, worn thin with 2 years of quiet shame. "I have arranged an annuity for you," Eleanor said, "out of what was recovered from Voss's own theft. Enough to keep a small shop, if you wish it, in a town far enough from here that no one need know your history unless you choose to tell it." Camille's composure broke then, briefly, in a way Eleanor's never had, and she pressed her gloved hand to her mouth and said, when she could, that she had expected fury, not fairness, and did not know what to do with the second. "Fury is easy," Eleanor said. "Fairness costs more, and lasts longer. I have found it is the better investment." Camille left the county within the month for a millinery shop 2 towns distant, and wrote once, that autumn, a short plain letter of thanks that Eleanor kept in her writing box beside her father's old letters, because it seemed, on reflection, to belong with the other proofs that decency, properly documented, tended to compound. The months that followed were built, as Eleanor had always built things, in small units rather than grand gestures. Julian moved his chair at breakfast, without comment, to sit beside her rather than at the table's distant head, and continued sitting there every morning after, until the housemaid stopped remarking on it, and simply set his place there as a matter of course. He began pouring her tea before she asked for it, which meant nothing in isolation, and, by October, meant everything in accumulation. He brought the tenant ledgers to her himself each week now, unprompted, and they went through the columns together at the same table where Voss's lies had once gone unquestioned, initialing each page jointly, a habit that outlasted the scandal that had prompted it. There was one evening, in late September, when an old habit reasserted itself without warning. A tenant's roof needed mending before the rains, and Julian, from old instinct, simply arranged it and paid for it himself without telling her, the way a man handles a small crisis alone, because he has spent a lifetime believing that asking for help is itself a kind of failure. "You did the right thing," Eleanor said, when she found out 3 days later, and did it alone, which was the wrong thing, in a house that no longer works that way. He was silent for a moment, then said, "You are right. I am sorry. I will do better," and did not simply say it, but the following week brought her a smaller matter, a fence rather than a roof, and asked her opinion before he acted, watching her face as though her answer mattered more than his own certainty, which it did now to him. Alice's 6th birthday came in September, and this time Julian was home before breakfast, sitting on the floor of the nursery in his shirt-sleeves, while his daughter walked the little dapple-grey horse along the edge of a rug, as though it had never spent a single dawn abandoned on a cold stair. "I would choose you," Julian said to Eleanor that night, in the small parlour, without preamble, the fire low and the house entirely still around them in the particular way a house goes still when it has finally stopped listening for trouble. "I have been choosing you, badly, for some time, without ever saying so. I mean to say so now, and to keep saying it, in whatever way you will let me." "Show me," she said, "not tonight, and not only in words. Show me over the years we have left." "I intend to," he said, and reached for her hand across the small space between their chairs, and she let him take it, which was its own 2-word treaty, spoken without a single word at all. 2 years passed, the way seasons do in a house that has stopped holding its breath, quickly and then all at once. Alice was 7, and kept the little wooden horse on the corner of her pillow every single night, a habit her father had begun and never once let lapse, tucking it there himself most evenings when his duties allowed, and asking Eleanor to do it on the nights they did not. Rowan Court's rent day audit, held openly in the barn each August since the scandal, had become a fixture of the county calendar rather than a memory of disgrace, a custom the tenants had come, without irony, to call simply the Duchess's day, and one which Julian insisted, in his own quiet way, would outlast them both, written into the estate's own governing charter so that no future steward could ever again mistake a great house's books for a private kingdom. Camille Doran's millinery shop, by report that reached the county second-hand, was thriving, and she sent Alice a ribbon every birthday, plain and well-made, with a short note that grew warmer each year. Voss was heard of once, working as a minor clerk in a distant port town, his name never spoken again at Rowan Court, in anything but the flat tone reserved for a lesson already learned. The house itself, visitors remarked, though none of them could quite say why, felt different than it once had. Warmer in a way that had nothing to do with fires, as though it had finally been permitted, after a long-held breath, to exhale. Eleanor Hartley had stopped asking, somewhere in the space of those 2 years, to be seen. She had not stopped by choosing silence, but by choosing work, by choosing paper, by choosing the plain, unglamorous business of making herself so thoroughly, so undeniably necessary, that the county, and then her own husband, and then at last the whole house itself, could no longer look past her if they tried. She had learned, in the end, that being loved was not the reward for being useful, and that a man who confused the two would go on confusing them until someone, calmly, without raising her voice, without a single tear, set the true accounts before him and made him read every line. She had made herself impossible to unsee, and that, she understood now, standing at the same staircase where a small wooden horse had once been left behind in sorrow and was now carried up each night in love, was not a thing that could ever again be taken from her.